Hello there, welcome to another video here on this Esoteric Circle YouTube channel. Pete Haskins along with Wanda, and it is raining on this Sunday morning. So under this the shelter of our home, we're going to stay here instead of going down to the river this morning. But blessings to you wherever you are at on your journey. It's great having you here. In our Discord group, we have a book study on Saturdays. And right now we're on chapter 7 of Maurice Nicoll's The New Man. If you're interested in that, just send me a message in the comments here and let me know. But Maurice Nicoll, as a kind of a disciple of Gurdjieff and a friend of Ouspensky, just an amazing writer, psychiatrist, and sage, and is an essential part of the Fourth Way teachings, as he gives an interpretation of these teachings of Gurdjieff. This book that we are studying is wonderful, and we are on the chapter that talks about Simon Peter in the Gospels. So the new man is an interpretation of parables and the miracles of Christ, and gets into some of the people, some of the characters within this. And Simon Peter's in chapter 7 here. And I want to read this one section that we talked about yesterday in our group. So if you're interested, send me a message here and I will connect you with our group. It's easy as that. Peter is promised the keys of heaven, which signifies that he has the power to understand the teaching that Christ was giving to mankind on earth about a possible inner evolution of man to an inner state called heaven, as distinct from earth. But as yet his power is intellectual, for rock or stone refers only to knowledge, the knowledge of the truth that Christ taught. He is mentally adequate, but as yet his belief in Christ is through Christ and not in himself. In this sense, he is comparable with the second category defined in the parable of the sower, where the man sown on rocky ground is described who receives the word of the kingdom. The teaching of a possible inner evolution of man, now with enthusiasm, but has yet to root in himself, so that when tribulation arises, he stumbles. He receives the word intellectually, hence the reference to rocky ground. He receives it as knowledge. And this is also shown in the fact that when Peter saw Christ, whom he regarded as a king, who would establish a kingdom on earth, being led away to the crucifixion, he denied him. He is always shown as passionate, violent, and undeveloped in his emotions. He had no emotional understanding, though he had apparently an intellectual grasp of the teaching. You must picture him as a hot-tempered, enthusiastic man, listening eagerly to everything Christ taught his disciples in private, remembering what was said, impatient of the others, with his whole emotional nature fastened on the actual visible person of Christ. He imagined himself capable of an undying loyalty to the person of Christ. He taught his teaching at one level, but did not see as deeply as probably some of the others saw. Hasty, quick, intellectually brilliant, violent, full of self-love, he was a man whom Christ recognized as being capable, after great suffering, to take hold of the teaching eventually from himself. Christ saw him as a man at present without root in himself, but capable of having a great depth of root, after he had given the shocks to his own nature that were necessary. And the shock of the crucifixion was the greatest shock of all to him, and to the disciples in general. Imagine what they felt when they witnessed Christ led forth to die the lowest kind of death, the death reserved only for criminals. How many of the followers of Christ must have felt that there could be no real truth or meaning in teaching they had heard if such a fate awaited the teacher? Since Peter could not value the teaching apart from the person of the teacher, that is, he had no root in himself, but he was outwardly dependent, Christ warns Peter about his inability to attain to the teaching apart from the teacher. let's dig in a little deeper there. Yesterday in group we had a discussion just about shocks and suffering, and how many of us have this intellectual part down pretty good. Most of us who are attracted to the Fourth Way and Orthodoxy in general have a lot of books. We get it. We know how to read. We know how to study this stuff. We know the ins and outs of it. But when it comes to really applying this in our life, it's a different thing. And sometimes we have mini shocks. We have times where the shocks are on a daily basis, where we have certain things that are said to us that make us reflect on our lives. And you may have a speeding ticket, or you may have someone yell at you at work, or you may have a bad grade in class, whatever has happened to you. But then there are the major shocks, the shocks that come when you have a diagnosis of cancer, or you have a diagnosis of a heart ailment, or you have a divorce, or you're fired from a job. Your job is threatened, you're humiliated. Fill in the blank, right? The shocks. I've had true shocks happen to me twice in my life, and the divorce was the second one, but the most violent shock for me was when I was turned down for ordination as a Methodist, as a young seminarian. And that uprooted me. The little root system that I had was so shallow. And it didn't take much for that little tree to topple over. And the suffering that I endured over that lasted for years, because it revealed my true nature and how fragile I was. And I realized how I had no foundation. And the intellectual part of it was revealed to just be worth nothing. When true shocks and true suffering happens to us, we have to be prepared. But the suffering is a gift. The suffering is the thing that actually creates the foundation. We have to have that weakness exposed. We have to have that weakness exposed. When I was going through that period of humiliation, which is what it was, Charles Ashanin said to me, "When you suffer, know that God has begun to answer your prayers." When you suffer, know that God has begun to answer your prayers. And that was such an enigmatic thing to say to me. And I didn't understand it. And I ended up, let's see if I've got it up here. I ended up writing my second book that I ever wrote. It's a different cover now, but this is the original cover that Ted picked. This is a sunset at his house, Ted Nottingham. The Transforming Power of Suffering. The Charles B. Ashanin's Theology of Humanity's Evolution. It's on Amazon, and I'll put the link there. But this is a thick little book about Charles and about the confusion and the beauty and the wisdom and the grace and the mercy and the love that comes when you accept a certain kind of suffering. So when we're talking about suffering, we're not talking about suffering that comes from drug abuse, that comes from someone who's a narcissist, that you are getting abused, in a real sadistic way. We're not talking about that kind of thing. We're not just talking about, in a codependent relationship, you're just continuing to take it. We're talking about suffering that you cannot control, that has come upon you, And you have to decide, do I accept it? Now, when you're in an abusive situation, you have to say, no, I'm not going to accept that kind of suffering. So I'm not talking about that. But I am talking about the suffering that comes when you have these events in your life, whether it's physical, whether it's professional, whether it's personal. And you just have to say, am I going to accept this? And am I going to climb up on that cross? And that is the thing that separates us, and it's going to separate you, and it's really the thing that could be holding you back, where we are taught in our society to avoid suffering, and the contrary is to be taken to heart. We need to accept that suffering, right? And accepting the suffering is the beginning of spiritual wisdom. Accepting, Durkheim said, accepting the unacceptable is the beginning of spiritual wisdom. And that is what I wrote about in here, the transforming power of suffering. And I just cannot say enough about how healing it has been for me to have events in my life that created suffering, because it cracked me open like a seedling in a fire, that afterward I was able to finally grow. So if you're going through a period of suffering, and you have determined that it is not a toxic suffering, it is a suffering that is just part of this life. You know, as Moraviev said, this is a mixtus orbis. This is this world of ours is a combination of good and evil. And we have to figure this out. And accepting the suffering of a cross, of the cross in our life, is the way in which you leap over the chasm. It's the way you evolve. It is part of your evolution. Teilhard de Chardin talks about this. The evolution, our evolution. It's not through AI, right? It's not through Neuralink. The bells. It's through the acceptance of suffering. This evolution that awaits us. Those are the bells of my church that I pastored. And the videos that I've done about quitting the congregation. That's it. They have a new pastor. So these events that happen in your life, that bring suffering, what would happen to you if you just accepted it? What would happen if you were just able to say, about this divorce, about this firing, about this accusation, right? About this diagnosis. Okay, it's here. I'm going to accept it. What would happen? What would happen to you? What would happen if you just let it roll over you? It's your life. It's your life, and it's precious. Take advantage of the time that you have.